Hello, I'm Deacon John Leeseth, and I'm one of the campus ministers of Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. I'm also one of the people who helped to plan a virtual event which originally happened on Tuesday, November 30th, 2021. The name of the event is Bitter Tears, After Boarding School, in Mourning, and the video which you're about to watch was edited from that event. After this welcome and introduction, you'll see a presentation by Dr. Denise K. Lajimodiere, author of Stringing Rosaries, The History, the Unforgivable, and the Healing of Northern Plains Boarding School Survivors. This video also includes a question and answer session with Dr. Lajimodiere, and thanks to her, we have permission to share this video freely. In fact, she enthusiastically supports the idea of more people watching this video, as it's a way for the stories of boarding school survivors to be heard. And in her research interviews with these survivors, she was frequently asked to tell their stories. So you may want to consider not only watching this video on your own, but sharing it with a group, perhaps with a network of friends or an organization, a book club, or a faith community of which you are a part. However you choose to watch this video, we encourage you to pause your watching in order to reflect after Dr. Denise's presentation. And we've included a short segment on reflection and facilitating reflective conversation immediately following the presentation, with the hope that it can be useful to you. Before I introduce Dr. Lajimodiere, I would like to share a bit about how the Bitter Tears event came into being. This past July 2021, along with a few dozen other people, most of whom are from the Fargo-Moorhead area, I joined in conversations convened by Tanya Redroad. Tanya invited us together to consider the question, where is the faith community now? Tanya was hearing this question among the local indigenous community in the days after the bodies of more than 200 unidentified Native children were counted using ground-penetrating radar on what used to be the property of the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia. In the days after a group of Rosebud Sioux children finally returned home, after dying in the care of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. In the days after U.S. Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland announced the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. These conversations, weekly at first, soon lifted up a need for more people to know about the American Indian boarding school system. Specifically those of us who are not Indigenous, and in a particular way, I believe, those of us who are Christians, because of the active participation of the Christian church and Christians in the majority of the boarding schools in both the United States and Canada. So a smaller group of us set about planning this event, and we are grateful for the presence of each of you participating in it. The primary goal of this event is to share an introductory or foundational understanding of the American Indian boarding school system. And we are deeply fortunate that Dr. Denise K. Lajimodiere graciously agreed to be our teacher. Our second primary intention is that this is not a one-and-done event for any of us, but rather an event and a conversation which encourages each one of us who is not Indigenous to further listening, learning, and action as we deepen our understanding that this is not someone else's history, but a part of our lives today. I want to name that we are talking about extremely traumatic and traumatizing events. Several times through these conversations over these past months, I've heard Indigenous people tell me it wasn't as bad as you're imagining. It was worse. What follows may traumatize and trigger, even if the facts and stories shared are not from your own experiences or from the experiences of your immediate family or community. Please consider your own support system should this occur. Also consider resources such as the Rape and Abuse Crisis Center in Fargo-Moorhead and the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Denise K. Lajimodiere. Denise is an enrolled citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, Belcourt, North Dakota. She has been involved in education for 44 years as an elementary teacher, principal, and as a professor, earning her bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees, all from the University of North Dakota. Dr. Lajimodiere is a retired associate professor from the School of Education, the Educational Leadership Program, North Dakota State University, Fargo. She is one of the founders of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Denise is a poet, a children's book author, and author of the academic book, Stringing Rosaries, The History, The Unforgivable, and the Healing of Northern Plains Boarding School Survivors. Denise is a traditional jingle dress dancer, Ojibwe birch bark biting artist, and lives in a cozy cottage by a lake on the Turtle Mountain Indian Reservation. Dr. Denise, on behalf of the team of people who came together to plan this event and everyone gathered tonight, we thank you for your expertise and wisdom and for your time and energy.
Bonjour, Anine. I'd like to offer a prayer before we get started tonight. Kishkimanatu, Dagawidu Kawishanam, we ask the Creator to hear our prayer. Jimano Chgeyang, so that we do good things. We pray to open our hearts, ears, and minds so that we may learn today to gain wisdom. Jimano Ijwe Bijayang, so that we have good things happen to us. Jimashkawiziyang, so that we have inner strength. Jimano Bimadiziyang, so that we have good health and live a good life. We ask Nimashomas, Inaneg, Gaye, Nokomas, Inaneg, the spirits of our ancestors to be with us here tonight. Kishkimanatu, we offer special prayers to the little ones that didn't return from boarding schools and healing prayers for the survivors that may be suffering today. Megwich Awaya, Misayu. Thank you to all of you for joining us here tonight. I'm going to share my screen. And I will begin. This is my book that I'm talking about here tonight. Thank you, John, for your self-care. So my interest in boarding schools began with listening to my grandfathers and my parents talk about their boarding school experience. This is my grandfather on my dad's side, Benjamin Lajimodiere, and his sister Martha, and they were sent to Fort Taunton boarding school just down the road here, about 90 miles. I just found records this past week of my dad's mother was also sent to boarding school. She happened to die in the 1918 flu epidemic, leaving my father and his sister orphans. Well, they were called orphans, even though Grandpa couldn't take care of them, so he gave them to an Oak Creek couple to raise. This is my mom on the far right, with their hands down. I think this is at Wapton Indian Boarding School. She did end up running away. I got her records, but she was also sent to a Catholic boarding school when she was younger. This is my father. So he was sent 3 days and 3 nights. He was of the stolen generation. I'll talk more of, to Chemawa, Oregon. And he is in the second row from the bottom, went to the fourth little boy over. So just a real brief history is in 1869, at that time, the US had an Indian problem. It was too expensive to keep doing a war campaign against the tribes in the United States. It cost the cavalry or the government up to $1 million every war campaign they did against us. So the peace policy allowed religious denominations to undertake the work of civilizing the Indians. And say one of the churches was the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions, and they established boarding schools both on and off reservations. Then in 1891, Congress authorized a Commission of Indian Affairs to enforce compulsory attendance. So they could withhold attendance, they could withhold rations, clothing, and other annuities. It was a forced removal. I call it the stolen generation. So the old couple that had my father, he was 9 years old, they were hiding him. They didn't want to send him to school, and he didn't speak a word of English. But when the government agent would come around, they would hide him in the bush. Finally, they threatened them with jail, or their food, their annuities, and even the wood. And here in North Dakota, in the dead of winter, it could mean certain death. So in 1879, Richard Pratt, he established Carlisle, and there's a longer story behind how he became involved with Native people. At the time, the saying was the only good Indian is a dead Indian, but he believed in that, but he instead believed more in his term was kill the Indian in him and save the man. So he started the first federal off-reservation boarding school. These are all the Christian denominations that I found that had boarding schools. Do I know all of the boarding schools yet? No. Someone from the Congregationalist, someone from Oregon, just contacted me a couple of weeks ago and said, can you tell us all the names of the Congregational schools, where they were located, the towns, and how many kids and the years they operated? And I said, oh my goodness, can you please do your own research and let us know, let me know, and let the National Boarding School Healing Congregation know. So we're still looking for boarding schools. And maybe during the question and answer towards the end of the program, someone can ask me about my search for boarding schools. This is what my dad told me. He was sent in 1925. He said, if you didn't go to church, you didn't eat. And I've heard that across all boarding school survivors that were sent. They didn't have a choice. They had to choose a church to go to. So as a professor, and after listening to my parents and my grandfathers talk about their boarding school experience, I decided to do what's called a qualitative interview research study. It's a complicated, complex process, but in the end of interviewing these people, and I interviewed survivors from the time they were born until they went to boarding school, their experience during boarding school, and their experience in their life as adults. And then there's themes that evolved. And so these are the 5 themes that shook loose in the research study. And I'll talk about each one of them. First theme was loss of identity. And that was loss of identity, loss of language, culture, ceremonies, traditions, loss of self-esteem, loneliness due to loss of parents and extended family, feeling of abandonment by parents, feeling lost and out of place when they returned home. So forced assimilation, of course, kill the Indian, save the man. Pratt would tell them all that is Indian in you is dead. He liked Indians, but he hated the culture. So he believed in total, absolute assimilation into white culture. So the kids, like my father and my mom, they didn't speak a word of English when they were sent to boarding school. So they had Lysol put in their mouth that would blister their mouths. And my dad said he couldn't eat for days. My mom was locked in a closet. And if the kids peed their pants while they were locked in the closet, then they got beaten and whipped for having done that once they got out. They were put in dungeons. I think I have a picture coming up. They were hit with rulers until fingers broke. Kids were killed during some of the beatings. They were shamed, ridiculed, punished, repeatedly told, stupid Indian, dirty Indian, you'll never amount to anything, resulting in self-hatred and internalized oppression. Julia said, the teacher made me feel ashamed for being Indian, and that is still with me today. She was in her 70s. One wondered why parents put them there. Roger said, when I was younger, I always wondered why my parents hated me, why they did that to me, why they sent me there. So when they returned home, it's called The Returned. You can see that there, they didn't fit back in home. Some of them were sent for like 12 years. They didn't even know their parents. They didn't know, they didn't recognize them, and they didn't fit back in. Think of all the birthdays and everything that these kids had missed. And when there's loss of parenting skills. That was a big issue with me when I did this research. I realized that my parents parented me and my siblings the way they were parented at boarding school. They weren't hugged. They weren't told they were loved. And that's across the board in boarding schools. So we were never hugged, and we were never told we were loved. And we were disciplined the way they were disciplined in the boarding school. which was pretty rough. So the kids were abused. There was corporal punishment, forced child labor, something called the outing program. They were always hungry. Pratt used military style discipline. My dad, he marched all these kids. It was across the board, Catholic schools, whoever ran these schools. The government contracted with Christian schools to run these boarding schools. There was no separation of church and state. So he used military style discipline. So they marched everywhere they went. And my dad marched with a little wooden gun when he got there when he was 9 years old. And later it was a regular gun. They answered to bells and whistles. Every minute of the day was timed, and they were doing something. They didn't have very much downtime. So there's something called a gauntlet, which is pretty horrifying. It did kill kids. My dad saw a kid get killed. They laid my father. My father got in trouble for making a joke about the matron and the headmaster maybe liking each other, and an older boy told on him. So he's made to lay over a bed, and the boys lined up behind him, and they were given a belt that had studs in it, he said, and they had to hit him. And if anybody eased up on hitting that, they would have to take his place. So he passed out from the pain, and he woke up in an infirmary, and he was there for 2 weeks laying on his stomach. He said he still had the scars from the day he died from that beating. So he did see a boy from Browning, Montana, that they burst his kidneys from the gauntlet. Kneeling on broomsticks. Josephine said they made you kneel on a broomstick if you were bad. Oh God, that hurt. Demon said for speaking Dakota, he had to kneel on a ruler with my hands in front of my face. If I leaned back, Father would grab my hair and the skin in the back of my neck and hold me straight up. I can still feel my scalp hurting. The sad thing is that Demas retained his language, but if he was in public and say the tribe asked him to give a prayer, an opening prayer, he couldn't do it because he could still feel the pain of what that priest did to him. So he never spoke his language again in public. He spoke with his wife. It's called stress torture. The United States used that. My father said that 4 boys ran away from Chimawa. They were brought back in, and they were brought into the cafeteria. Ropes were strung over the beams. The boys' hands were tied, and they were lifted up so that their feet couldn't touch the floor. So again, torture. Wooden paddles if they wet the bed. There was all kinds of punishments if you wet the bed. The girls, someone had hidden their sheets in the closet, and the nun said who wet the bed, and no one would say who it was. So she made the girls pee in a bucket, and then she slammed their faces in the pee in the bucket. So they were beating with belts, sticks, heavy books were thrown at them. They were hit with fists until they were knocked out. My uncle, he said that a nun cut out the inner part of a tire, and that's what she beat him with. And he was also beat with, they were beat with razor straps. So there was forced child labor. The government didn't provide enough money to support these schools. So the kids had to do all the work. So they worked in the kitchen, the dining room, they did the mopping, they did the laundry, the huge laundry rooms, and there's something called mangles at that time that would injure the kids. They worked in the bakery, the cleaning, the garden, the barn. They even built some of the buildings. So they worked half a day, and then they went to school half a day. And thus, because there wasn't enough monies, and everything in the garden and so on was sent out to other people to buy so that they could maintain the school. So they were hungry and malnourished. Almost everyone you talked to that went to boarding school said they were hungry. There was maggots in the food. There was worms in the food. There was a teacher that was new to Bismarck school, just down the road here again in Bismarck, North Dakota. And she saw worms in the cereal that the kids were eating. And she ran back and told the cook in the kitchen, who was a white lady, and said, there's worms in their food. And the white lady said, oh, they're used to it. And she saw them cutting off green, moldy parts of meat and so on and serving it to the kids. But if you vomited, Dad said they would rub your face in the vomit, or you were made to eat your vomit. So they were hungry all the time. Tommy stole a jar of cherries. I was hungry all the time, and he was beat with a razor strap for stealing the food. There's something called an outing program. Again, they were sent as cheap labor to homes in surrounding towns, again, to so-called to assimilate them, but there's a lot of abuse. And the sad thing is that these kids were sent so far away from home, like to Carlisle, and then they were sent from there further to white people's homes, and some of them died. So there's a Dr. Lou White is looking for graves of these kids that were buried in these white towns that are just in these cemeteries by themselves. So there was mental abuse. They couldn't tell their parents what was happening. Letters were redacted. Was sent home and redacted those that came in. This one lady said her and her sister got to call their mom, but the nun was standing above them with a great big stick. And if they would have said anything about that was going on with them, they would have gotten beaten. So they were just crying and just talking to the mom, but not able to tell what was going on at the school. One of the toughest things that I learned that I didn't hear my dad or my grandfather or my mom talk about, because I didn't think to ask the question, was sexual abuse. So it appears across all the boarding schools here and across the medicine line with our First Nations relatives in Canada, that most of these kids were abused at the boarding schools, no matter who ran them, if it was run by the government or by any of the church denominations. And if you weren't being abused, you saw it happen. Roger said that sexual abuse would happen at night when all of us were sleeping. The brothers would come in and take someone out. When the kids came back, they would be crying. They didn't want to be touched. They were always scared. No one ever talked about it. That's why I say there is this resounding silence in boarding school survivors. It's hard for them to talk about the trauma. They get re-traumatized. And there was not just priests, there are also nuns, and there are also government school workers and dorm workers that molested these kids. So when interviewing some elders that went to school at Fort Taunton, they told me that they were put in dungeons for discipline or for not being able to speak English. And one elder, he wouldn't go to Fort Taunton. He just couldn't bring himself to go there. But he told me where he was put into this dungeon. And it was across from the boys' dorm, and it was where the superintendent's office would have been. So I went over there with some of the young people that work there, and we went to this area and we tore up the carpet there, or the linoleum, and sure enough, we found this trap door. When we opened the trap door, there was stairs going down, and we even found a marble there, an orange marble. It was pretty incredible. So there's two other dungeons that elders, two different eldermen told me about, and they were underneath the boys' steps, which we found. And then there was another one that was way deep, dark in the corner where tourists can't go to these areas, but they let me go to, mostly because I'm a writer and so on, and a researcher. And we found another dungeon that one of my friends here said that her father was thrown in, and that he would sing Ojibwe songs or Sundance songs at the top of his lungs, and they keep him down there longer. Said he lost all sense of time of day or night when he was down there, because there's absolutely no light. And they would give him water and bread. So that's the one I'm talking about. This is way in you can't tell here because we had bright lights on it, but this is absolutely dark. And once you turn that around and put the cover on, the kids wouldn't be able to see anything. So that was another form of torture for these kids. So why do we have cemeteries? You know, I went to public school. There was no cemetery at the public school I went to. I was not sent to boarding school. My parents, there's no way in hell they would have sent us kids to boarding school. So these are the diseases. They were overcrowded, they were deplorable conditions. They were cold, freezing. The beds were close together, so they didn't take the kids and separate them if they were sick. They kept them in the dorms. So these are just some of the things the kids died of. And there's more. My dad said this kid was killed by a train while running away. There was a lot of suicides also on the train, the railroad tracks that went through the school system that went by the boarding school. So I found, it was probably a missed opportunity, but I wish I would have had a counselor help me with the research and do a PTSD check on these survivors, as old as they were. They were mostly in their 70s and over. So one couldn't go in a brick building because it reminded her of the boarding school. Another, she stayed, even though she was molested by a priest for a long time, she still went to Catholic school, but she couldn't shake the priest. I mean, she went to church. She couldn't shake the priest's hand. She wouldn't touch the priest's hand. She ended up 5 weeks into a mental institution because things were coming unstuffed with her. But even the 5 weeks that she was in this mental institution, she did not tell her doctors that she was sexually molested by a priest. And that's the reason she was there. But she was still ashamed. So I should have stopped him. She was like 4 and 5 years old, and this monster was molesting her. So unresolved grief, relationship issues, alcoholism, of course, like my parents, lack of parenting skills. Where did they learn to be parents? I mentioned earlier, education, they worked half a day and they were in school for half a day. So like say, if you went to school there and you graduated 8th grade and went back to the reservation, well, there's sure you had a certificate from your boarding school, but it really wasn't because you didn't put in enough hours and so on. You really didn't have an 8th grade graduation certification according to the state. So when they went back home, they just had the poorest of education. And of course, the girls were, well, it will show in a minute so this is what the boys were trained for. They were not trained to go on to higher education. Only 8th grade is what they were encouraged to do. So they were encouraged to go on to college. So my father, once he learned English, it took him 6 months to learn English when he got there. He said, I just couldn't learn that English. He got good at math. He was good at math. I think he was a total genius. So they made him a carpentry apprentice, and he did earn a living for us as a carpenter. But these were all only what they were encouraged to do. For the girls, my mom did all of this, and she showed me how to do all of this too. Yeah. So they had a poor education. And I can tell elders on this reservation that went to boarding school because their houses are spotless. Our house was absolutely spotless. My mom and my grandma also helped raise us. She said, it shouldn't matter if you're very poor. You can, we had like holes in we were very poor. My dad was alcoholic and he would lose jobs and they'd go on strike and so on. So, and then we couldn't work in the wintertime because you can't do carpentry work when it's 80 below zero. So our house always had big holes in the linoleum and so on, but it was spotless. So what is the legacy of boarding schools right now is what we're looking at because of the news finally of Kamloops. The legacy of boarding school is one of intergenerational trauma and historical trauma, which is the collective emotional and psychological injury over a lifespan across generations, resulting from the cataclysmic history of genocide. It is the legacy of numerous traumatic events, community experiences over generations. Over successive generations, we have experienced traumatic assaults that have had enduring consequences for our families and our communities. The legacy is one of historical unresolved grief, like the lady that, the survivor that was in the hospital and she didn't talk about what happened to her. Historical unresolved grief is resulting from historical trauma of genocide, grief that has not been expressed, acknowledged, or resolved. In the book, the last chapter, I talk about my healing journey that I had to go on to forgive my father and my mom for the way we were raised. We weren't molested, but he became a pretty violent alcoholic and verbally abusive. And like I said, as kids, we were beat with a belt, and we had to kneel in the corner. We were disciplined the way they were disciplined. We didn't have to kneel on broomstick. So I had to go through that healing journey myself. It's disenfranchised grief that can't be publicly mourned. So my dad, I showed him a video called In the White Man's Image, and he died in 1993. He was 77 years old, and just before he got sick, I brought home this video to show him, and it talked about Carlisle, and it talked about Chimawa and the reason for boarding schools and so on. When the video ended, he put his head in his hands and leaned over, and he said, "So that's what the goddamn hell they were trying to do to us." So that's his unresolved grief. He never knew what happened to him and why. He was forced, to become a Christian and forced into and speaking English and so on, and all the military marching until just before he died. So I call that his soul wound. There's something called boarding school syndrome, PTSD, that include recurring intrusive memories, nightmares, flashbacks, detachment disorder, deficient knowledge of traditional culture and cultural skills, trouble sleeping, poor anger management, deficient parenting skills, tendency to abuse alcohol or drugs. Boarding schools represent a deliberate policy of ethnocide and cultural genocide and human rights abuses, somewhere between dungeons and death camps. They were overcrowded, understaffed, underfunded, they had limited resources, and they were places where diseases ran rampant. So just really quickly, we need to look at healing, and what does healing look like? First of all, there's the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners up in Canada. We met with them, had a chance to meet with them. And Willie Littlechild, one of the commissioners, said that healing has to begin, forgiveness within our families. I had to forgive my father. And when I understood my parents and what they went through, it's easy to forgive them for the way we were raised. So healing has to start within the family. And then we look at communities. So each community, whether urban Indian or on a reservation, they have to decide what healing looks like for each individual tribe, because we're all different. And we need to ask survivors, what does healing look like for you? So it could be a church ceremony. It could be, they say it's going back to our tribal traditional spirituality. Some say an apology. Right now, Canada is rooting for the Pope. They're going over to visit with him, some people from Canada, and they say it's not on his agenda to go give an apology. So, and some say, well, we'll never get our childhood back. What's the use of an apology? So some say land back. They're asking the churches to give land back, where they held the church that had the boarding schools, or where the boarding schools were. Give the land back to the tribe. Some say an apology would be a recognition of the government of what happened to them. So there, it's very complex, and there's a document I'll refer you to. So now, the thing that made me just absolutely cry is Deb Haaland, Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland, when she said that she was going to start a federal boarding school initiative to look for the cemeteries and the potential burial sites and so on. The National Boarding School Healing Coalition has worked for over a decade to try to bring the boarding school era horrors issue to national attention. But I say it took the national, international news of Kamloops before it hit the national news. So now we have her helping us. I have a letter from the Department of Interior person at the time from about 1898 to Chimawa that said, we're not going to fund any more kids being sent home. And if you ask us for monies, we're going to deny you. So that's why we have boarding schools. To flash forward to Secretary Deb Haaland saying, we're going to look for these babies. Oh, it just gets me emotional. So it's like we have help. Finally, someone's helping us at the national level, bringing this awareness to a national level. And then Holland and Warren are introducing a bill called the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policy in the United States Act. And that's been reintroduced into Congress just recently. And Deb has just started tribal consultation. So we have a chance to look at what healing means. So I'm going to stop there, and then maybe during the questions, someone can ask me about my list of boarding schools that I have. Language. Well, I think, okay, how do we forgive the unforgivable? Okay, went through that. These are ways that we can heal. There's a Orange Shirt Day. Our tribe did this. We all put our names of our survivors and our relatives that went on the teepee. So that was a tribal ceremony. That was cool. Orange Shirt Day. I encourage you to order this book and wear orange shirt. That's one thing you can do, is wear orange shirts anytime, but especially on the 30th of September. So this is about, you can talk about the boarding schools. This is Carlisle. And there's also this is a school, I think down in Fort Yates. They all have these pictures of, look at these babies. I mean, they're just tiny. They're young as 2, 3, 4 years old. Another school. So I encourage you all to download this document. It's about 100 pages, but it goes deeper into what healing would look like in communities. Okay, thank you. Language.
Thank you, Dr. Denise. We asked of Dr. Denise the impossible, to speak within about a half an hour, and it's just too small. So if we recognize that this is a too small container of something that needs more of consideration and care, and attention. What we're going to do now as a group is spend some time in small groups for some facilitated conversation. And if you're like me, you may find yourself struggling for words in the face of this shared history and story, which continues to shape our present day. Each small group's facilitator has been invited and prepared to assist these conversations in a way that supports authenticity and respect and deep listening. And Chris has organized us into about 25 small groups so that people will have an opportunity to talk and speak and listen. Once our small group conversation time is over, we'll reconvene as a large group for a time of questions and answers with Dr. Denise. So remember that at any time during this event, you're invited to share questions through the Zoom chat. You can see there's a specific chat where you can chat questions for Dr. Denise. So thank you to all of our conversation facilitators, and thank you to Chris as we enter into those small groups now.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Elijah Amelsley. I'm the Assistant Director of Student Engagement at Concordia, also labeled as questions for Dr. Denise. We are now going to be doing the Q&A portion of this event for about 15 to 20 minutes, give or take. So again, if you have any questions during this time, feel free to go into the chat feature of Zoom and send them to me. And again, I'm labeled as questions for Dr. Denise. So hopefully that should be pretty easy to find. But we did have a couple questions already. So Dr. Denise, you had mentioned during your presentation that someone had requested a comprehensive list of boarding schools. So I was wondering, or well, we got a question just wondering about what has that search process looked like for you or for others, and if you could speak a little bit more on that.
Yes, I was up in Canada at the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners in about 2008. I was asked to be an outside international observer to their truth-telling process. And I always say the United States has not begun the truth-telling process yet. Maybe with Deb Holland that we will start. But at dinner that night, they looked at me and they said, well, how many boarding schools do you have in the United States? They knew exactly how many boarding schools I had. They knew how many survivors were still alive. And I couldn't answer. No one had ever asked the federal government or ever asked the churches how many boarding schools they ran. So I made it my life's goal to find boarding schools in the United States. So I started a boarding school search. It's been over a 12-year search. And it's been a tough search, but I've come up with 408. And in the latest printing of the book, there's now a list of 406, and I found 2 more since then. But it's I have a statement that I had them put in there about the difficulty of just looking for boarding schools. It's the justice search is tedious, frustrating, painstaking, and time-consuming. It's taken me years, over a decade. I would locate a document online, and then that document would mention other schools, and it would just take months. And the boarding schools for Oklahoma, I had to hire someone to help me. And the archives are in their university archives, government offices, church archives, museums, historical societies, personal collections, not to mention records that are lost or destroyed over the years to fires. So that was, there's also another issue, I don't can't find it. You know, they have all kinds of different names. So that was, you had to look for, you can't find it. You had to look for a labor school, boarding school, a mission school. You had to look for all kinds of different names if you wanted to. And then some boarding schools went through 3, 4 different names. So I'm still sort of looking for schools. It's they just kind of come up. Some come up on Twitter, some come up on Facebook, some come up in the news. So then I'll look at my list and see if I still have it. So it's just a shame. It's awful that we do not know the number of boarding schools here in the United States. So there's also researchers at the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition that we all work together to add to this list. So yeah, it's been quite the process just to find the boarding schools that we have. But no one had ever, I went to Marquette, no one had ever asked the Catholic Church how many boarding schools they ran, and that's just one of the 14 denominations. And so I spent a week at Marquette looking through 35 huge boxes, file by file, day school, boarding school, and have a list of the Catholic boarding schools, but they're still popping up. So that research wasn't perfect either, but it was a start. But that's the type of research it takes.
Continuing on sort of along that train of thought of, first of all, thank you everyone for sending in all your questions. Please have patience with me as I try to sort them. But continuing with the list of the boarding schools, some folks are wondering where they can find specific information about schools within their current state, and then going even further, if they identify schools where they, you know, is there a place they can go to find information about specific schools within their state?
Yeah, we're just starting because of the national news. So what NABS is doing, you know, when we started NABS in 2011, we had $2,500. Canada had $5 billion over since 1996 to do their boarding school work. NAB just got an $11 million grant, and they hired researchers. So the researchers are vetting this list of schools, and then they're going to add like a map that has the city they were in, the years that they operated, and the number of kids that started out, and the denomination or the government, whoever ran the school. So we're just now, well, we've been working for 10 years to try to gather this information. So do we have it? No, it's not available yet. So you can look in my list, look at the school and then go look online, and you will find as much information as you can about each individual school. Yeah. So we're not there yet. Canada's decades ahead of us in starting this process.
Okay, I'm trying to keep up with the questions in terms of the same theme. So this recent one I just got, someone's wondering if some of the boarding schools had federal funding, what has the Federal Freedom of Information Act request turned up?
We did a FOIA to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they got back to us and said, we don't do research. So too bad. They shut us down. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they do not know how many boarding schools I ran. We have to do that research ourselves. It's pretty disappointing.
We've got a couple questions along the theme of healing. So I'll start with the personal one for you first, Dr. Denise. You had mentioned briefly about what healing has looked like with you and your family and your parents. Someone was just curious. Could you speak a little bit more about how that healing looked for you, or what that process was like for you, or that experience was like for you in light of holding, wanting to heal and wanting to forgive, and yet at the same time, how, knowing how you were raised and things of that nature?
Well, one of the best healing for me, and that I left it out of the presentation, was talk therapy. But we have to, healing will look like when we get our psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, social workers, and so on, trained specifically in healing for trauma and trauma related to boarding school. So I just happened to be in the hospital about 8 years ago or so. I had pneumonia, but my pneumonia doctor was also a psychiatrist, and I was in Fargo, and I said, so do you work with Native people? He goes, oh yeah. I said, do you know anything about boarding schools? And he said, no. So the legacy of boarding school that I went through, that litany of lists, he needed to, people need to know that. So what helped me was when I finally found a Native psychiatrist in Moorhead, and he's from my tribe. And he just sat there and he told me all about me and the history and trauma and intergenerational trauma history. I mean, he saved my sanity. He really did. So talk therapy has helped me a lot. But I didn't forgive my mom, my dad till after they had passed away. It was just too, even when my dad sat there with his head down and said, so that's what the hell they did to us. We had never hugged or said, I love you or anything like that. So I couldn't comfort him. Didn't know how. That was pretty tough, sad moment. But I didn't understand then what I understand now about how we were parented and why. So yeah, it's been my brother and sister. My brother has passed away. He was alcoholic and died of that too. And my sister will probably die of alcoholic and drug overdose. They haven't forgiven my parents for the way we were raised. So, but I've gone through a lot of therapy.
Thank you for sharing that. You kind of led into the next question. You talked about, how therapy's helped with your own personal healing, kind of broadening that to healing within Indigenous communities. What does that look like from a community healing standpoint? And someone had a follow-up to that of just, in light of community healing, is there ways that people can support that effort to have community healing within Indigenous communities?
That's going to be a longer conversation. That's why I think they just posted trigger points. So I've got all of these marks here of what healing looks like. And Canada has 103 healing programs that they instituted over their decades. So we can look to them. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. So that's a much longer conversation of strategies for healing, what the definition of what healing is, monies that need to flow into communities. Canada, they were able to do a class action lawsuit. And so if you were in boarding school for 5 years, you got $10,000 for every year you were in boarding school. And then if you were sexually molested, you hired a lawyer, which was awful, but they could get up to like $250,000. But the money, when we met with the commissioners, they said, don't do money. Well, we can't anyway. We can't do a class action suit because of statute of limitations. But the money, oftentimes, if the person wasn't in a program of healing, that money just made them feel awful. So So they encourage us not to do that. So we're not doing that. So anything that we do community-wide has to be a collective community program to help specific to boarding school survivors. And the people who are that lived through the worst of the boarding school era are starting to pass away. A lot of some of the people I interviewed for my book have already passed away. So sort of like Holocaust survivors are starting to pass away, and they're, saying, don't ever forget what happened to us. Well, the people that I interviewed, the boarding school survivors, said, please tell the world what happened to us. And I want to tell the world, similar to Holocaust survivors, so that the world will never forget what the government did to us during the boarding school era. So I'd like to see people record their stories, but again, they get re-traumatized if they tell their stories. So many of them, one man, he said, my story will forever be right here in the back of his head. And we know through therapy that we're only as healthy as our secrets. So many boarding school survivors right now are totally triggered and traumatized by the finding of the babies. Well, we knew they were there, but by the national news of the babies at Kamloops, it's triggered some of the people that I interviewed, and they've called me, and I've encouraged them to get into talk therapy. We have really good Native therapists, psychiatrists here on our reservation that are from our tribe, that are trained in trauma. So I encouraged him to get back into talk therapy. Yeah.
We've got a couple questions from folks just wondering, kind of post small group conversation. Do you have any advice on what's next for those in the audience, those listening, just what's next in terms of action steps for healing, for moving forward, for apologies, reparations, things along those lines?
I think I'd like to hear what all of you have to say about what you think is what's next. Just an overarching, it's like to look yourself up, what being an ally to BIPOC people mean. What is, white fragility, what does that mean? And then, talk to your legislators about Deb Haaland and Senator Warren's, they're going through Congress. So the Truth in Healing Commission Act encouraged your political people to support that, get involved with the politics there. So right now it's mostly tribes need to look at, what healing means for us, and also donate, say, to NABS. They actually are doing scholarships now for boarding school intergenerationals. Like, I'm an intergenerational. I didn't go to boarding school, but I still suffer the effects of my parents having gone to boarding school. So they are actually raising money and have given scholarships for those kids to go to school. I think that's wonderful. So donate to NABS. Giving Tuesday or always Wednesday, but yeah.
So we are running out of time for the Q&A, but Dr. Denise, during the break, when everyone else was in their small groups, you had mentioned perhaps reading the Bitter Tears poem. And so
Okay.
I was wondering if you would be willing to do that, just as sort of a closing to our Q&A.
Yeah, I wrote this after I came back from the Chemawa Cemetery, and I always wonder if my father, well, I'll just read the poem. It's from a chapbook called Bitter Tears, which is from a small press called Mammoth Publications, I believe. Yeah, Mammoth Publications, if you want to order a copy of it. So Bitter Tears. The school's maintenance man drives me to the cemetery, unlocks a sagging gate under a wrought iron arch, stark letters, Chemawa Cemetery, 1886. Ancient fir trees tower above the graves. Weeds and wildflowers cover the small, flat plaques. Offering tobacco prayers, I gently sweep aside the weeds to read the names and the years they died. What did they die of? Loneliness? Worked to death in the barns and fields? Pneumonia? A beating from the gauntlet? Suicide on the tracks in front of the school? I count 21 plaques in a row with the date 1918, the year of the flu epidemic. I find plaques stamped with the years my father was a student there. Did he know this boy? That one? Were they friends? As a carpenter apprentice, did he hammer together the caskets that they were buried in? Was there a funeral? How were their parents told? Sap seeps down a fir tree's trunk like bitter tears, its roots tugging at a plaque, holding a lone child in embrace. I brace against a tree and weep for the children, for the parents left behind, for my father who lived, for those who didn't. English. Oh.
Thank you for reading that. And thank you to everyone for your thoughtful questions. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for the Q&A. Dr. Denise, I'm grateful for the words and the wisdom that you shared tonight and the space that you've created for this conversation and this learning to occur. For those who aren't Indigenous in the room or the Zoom tonight, I hope that this has been informative, but I also hope that we can continue to create conversations around this topic and continue listening and reflecting, donating financial resources as able. And I'm now going to pass it along to Martin for closing remarks.
Well, thanks, everyone. Everyone who participated in this evening and to those who made the event happen. Sorry about that. Was that muted? I thought I had shut my mute off. Okay, good. Special thanks to those who joined us tonight who have attended boarding schools and who may have loved ones who attended boarding schools. We'd also like to give a heartfelt thank you to Dr. Denise Lajimodiere, and we acknowledge the kind of energy that it takes to present these stories and what it must take from you. And we are grateful for your work, Denise. And we invite you all to further listening, learning, sharing, and action opportunities. Each participant and facilitator will receive a follow-up email with more information, including a link to the recording of tonight's program with all the small group discussions. And I'll drop some additional resources to continue learning into the chat. And this information will be included in the email that you will receive as well. So if our tech people, is that going up into the chat? Can people see that? Yeah, I have a list there if you want to check in. And that's by no way an all-encompassing list, but there are a few books that are mentioned there, and then also a PBS documentary that recently came out. And so as you do learn more, take what you have learned and bring that into conversation with others. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, sometimes these conversations may come about from things that you have heard that have been hurtful. And there is a way that we can respond to these things. These conversations can take place anywhere that you happen to gather with other people. It might be around the dinner table. It might be while having a place for coffee or a drink with friends. And like I said, sometimes you may hear something that is hurtful and we can respond, but it doesn't have to be confrontational. We can call each other in, as Loretta J. Ross would say, instead of calling others out. And the idea is to open up conversations, not to shut them down. In the future, we'll also be holding more events. This isn't a one-off type of thing. We want to continue our learning and giving you opportunities to learn more, and then also for actions that can come up in the future. So there will be other opportunities. And I want to thank you all again. And just take care and have a good evening, and be aware that we will be sending an email out that will have more resources and opportunities for you. So again, thank you all and have a wonderful evening and take care of yourself.